There is a dimension beyond what you can see on your television screen, beyond the comfort of familiar reruns, beyond the safety of syndication packages, beyond the careful hands of network executives who decide what you are allowed to remember. It is a dimension of suppressed history, of stories deemed too dangerous, too raw, too honest for their time. You are about to enter that dimension, because today, we are talking about the single most controversial episode in the entire history of the Twilight Zone, an episode that aired once in 1964 and then disappeared from public view for over 5 decades. No reruns, no home video release, no streaming, just silence, until now. To understand why this episode was buried, you first have to understand the man who built the world it lived in. Rod Serling was not simply a television writer. He was a veteran of the Pacific Theater in World War II, a man who had parachuted with the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment and witnessed violence that most Americans watching television in 1959 could not have imagined. He came home changed. He came home with questions that polite society was not particularly interested in answering. Questions about what war does to human beings, about what fear does to communities, about how quickly ordinary people can turn on each other when the right pressure is applied. The Twilight Zone, which debuted on CBS on October 2, 1959, was his answer to all of that. Not an answer in the sense of a solution, but an answer in the sense of a reckoning. Every week, through stories involving time travel, alien invasions, parallel universes, and supernatural forces, Serling was actually talking about something much closer to home. He was talking about McCarthy-era paranoia, about nuclear dread, about racial prejudice, about the way America told itself one story while living out an entirely different one. He had learned early that the only way to say dangerous things on American television was to disguise them. His 1956 teleplay, written about the murder of Emmett Till, had been gutted beyond recognition by network censors. The victim was changed from a black teenager in Mississippi to an unspecified foreign man. The setting was scrubbed of any recognizable American geography. By the time it aired, the story had been emptied of its entire meaning. Serling was devastated, and he was furious. The Twilight Zone became his workaround. If you set your story on Mars, suddenly you could talk about totalitarianism. If your protagonist was a robot, you could explore questions of identity and personhood that primetime drama wouldn't touch. If your villain was an alien collective, you could examine the mob mentality of small-town America without anyone from a small town in America threatening to cancel their sponsorship. Serling called the genre of science fiction his Trojan horse, and for 5 seasons, it worked. But the system was never fully on his side. CBS executives grew increasingly anxious as the show's political undertones became harder to ignore. Sponsors were skittish, ratings fluctuated, and behind the scenes, Serling was in a near-constant battle over what he was allowed to say and how directly he was allowed to say it. By the 5th and final season of the show's original run, those tensions had reached a breaking point. The episode is called The Encounter. It aired on May 1, 1964, during the show's 5th season, and it was written by Martin M. Goldsmith, with Serling serving in his familiar role as narrator and guiding presence. It starred Neville Brand, a decorated World War II combat veteran in real life, as a man named Fenton, and it starred a relatively unknown actor at the time named George Takei as Arthur Takamori, a young Japanese-American man looking for yard work. The entire story unfolds in a single attic. There is no spaceship, there is no monster, there are no special effects. Just 2 men, a cramped room full of old belongings, and a Japanese samurai sword mounted on the wall. Fenton is sorting through decades of accumulated junk when Arthur knocks on his door, asking if there is any work available. Fenton, in a gesture of rough-edged hospitality, invites him up and offers him a beer. Their conversation begins casually enough. 2 strangers making small talk. But Serling's genius, and Goldsmith's, was always in the slow tightening of the atmosphere. The friendly conversation begins to curdle. Fenton starts talking about the war, about the Pacific, about Japanese soldiers he fought and killed. He talks about the sword and how he came to own it, And as he talks, something in his voice begins to shift. Something in Arthur's eyes begins to change. Then Arthur reveals something that stops the episode cold. His given name is Taro, and his father, he says, was not simply a Japanese immigrant living peacefully in America. His father was an informant, a man who fed intelligence to Imperial Japan, a man who, Arthur confesses with an expression that mingles shame and rage in equal measure, played some role in the events that led to Pearl Harbor. From that moment forward, the attic stops being a place where two strangers are having a beer. It becomes a pressure cooker. Fenton's wartime guilt and his racial suspicion feed each other. Arthur's inherited shame and his barely suppressed fury feed each other. The sword on the wall seems to exert a pull on both of them. Arthur claims it has a spirit, that it wants something, that it is not done yet. When the encounter aired, the response from viewers was immediate and divided. Complaints flooded into CBS. Japanese-American community organizations raised objections specifically to the storyline involving Arthur's father. The suggestion that a Japanese-American man had aided Japan in the attack on Pearl Harbor struck many as a cruel and irresponsible smear, particularly given the historical context that most television viewers in 1964 were only beginning to dimly understand. That historical context is essential here. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States government had forcibly relocated over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry into internment camps scattered across the American interior. The vast majority of those imprisoned were American citizens. They had not committed any crimes. They had not been charged with anything. They had not been given trials. They had been imprisoned because of their ethnicity, because fear and war hysteria had been allowed to override every principle the country claimed to stand for. It was one of the most significant civil liberties violations in American history, and in 1964, the government had still not formally acknowledged it or apologized for it. To air an episode in which a Japanese-American character confirms, even in a psychologically ambiguous way, that his family had ties to Japanese intelligence was seen by many as a dangerous reinforcement of exactly the propaganda that had been used to justify the internment in the first place. That criticism was legitimate, and it deserves to be taken seriously even now. But here is where the situation becomes genuinely complicated. Because the episode was not making a simple argument that Japanese Americans were disloyal, it was not propaganda for internment. It was doing something far more unsettling. It was depicting two men, both of them compromised, both of them damaged, both of them capable of violence, sitting across from each other with decades of unprocessed history between them. Fenton is no hero. He admits to killing a man who was surrendering. He took a sword as a trophy of death. He is haunted and unstable, and in many moments, frightening. The episode was not saying that Arthur's father was guilty. It was asking what it means to carry guilt, whether it was earned or inherited, or simply assigned by others. It was asking what happens to two people when the violence of war follows them home and sits in the corner of an ordinary room like a sword on a wall. CBS did not engage with that complexity. Network executives saw complaints. They saw sponsor anxiety. They saw a show already on the edge of cancellation, already fighting for ratings, already costing more than it was returning, and they made the simplest calculation available to them. They pulled the episode. When the Twilight Zone entered syndication, the encounter was not included. When the series was released on home video, the encounter was not there. When cable channels ran their Twilight Zone marathons year after year, the encounter was the episode that was always just slightly out of reach. What most people watching the encounter in 1964 did not know, and what gives the episode an almost unbearable layer of meaning in retrospect, is that George Takei had personally lived the experience his character was alluding to. Takei was born in Los Angeles in 1937. He was 4 years old when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. He was 5 years old when soldiers appeared at his family's door, and his parents were given 48 hours to gather what they could carry. His family was sent to the Rohr War Relocation Center in Arkansas. Later, They were transferred to the Tule Lake camp in California. He spent years of his childhood behind barbed wire, watched over by armed guards, separated from the country he'd been born into. His father tried to shield him from the worst of it. He tried to frame their imprisonment as an adventure, as something temporary and manageable. But Takei has spoken in interviews throughout his life about the specific, unshakable memory of watching his mother cry while packing their belongings, and of not being old enough to fully understand why, but being old enough to understand that something had been taken from his family that they would never entirely get back. When he took the role of Arthur Takamori in The Encounter, he brought all of that with him. Every scene in which Arthur talks about what it means to be Japanese American in a country that treated Japanese Americans as suspects, every moment in which Arthur's shame and anger blur into each other without resolution, was informed by lived experience that no script could fully contain. In 2016, the Sci-Fi Channel, in the course of preparing a full New Year's Eve marathon of every Twilight Zone episode ever produced, made the decision to include The Encounter. No fanfare, no lengthy justification, just the original episode, uncut, airing for the first time in over 5 decades, slipped into the marathon between 2 other episodes, as though it had never been missing at all. The response was significant. Longtime fans of the series, who had spent years trying to track down bootleg recordings, finally saw the episode in its original form and found that the reality matched the reputation. Younger viewers, who had never heard of the episode, encountered it cold and found themselves genuinely shaken. Critics who revisited the series in the context of the 2016 moment, a moment already charged with anxieties about race, belonging, and American identity, found the episode disturbingly current. That currency has not faded. If anything, it has intensified. The years since 2016 have seen a documented and substantial rise in anti-Asian hate incidents across the United States. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian Americans were subjected to harassment, assault, and murder at rates that shocked communities and made international news. People who had been born and raised in America were told to go back to countries they had never lived in. Elderly people were attacked on public transit. The language of suspicion and collective blame that had been used to justify the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942 echoed through news coverage and social media in ways that were impossible to ignore. There is something worth sitting with here that goes beyond any single episode, any single act of network censorship, or any single historical injustice. Rod Serling spent his entire career asking one fundamental question in 100 different forms. He asked it through nuclear survivors and robot servants and aliens wearing human faces and men who could stop time. He asked it through every clever genre disguise he could invent, because the direct version of the question was too uncomfortable for the system he was working inside. The question was this: what kind of people are we, and what are we prepared to do about it? Not what kind of people were they, the soldiers, the politicians, the executives, the censors. What kind of people are we, right now, watching this story, feeling what we feel, making the choices we make about what to look at and what to look away from? The Twilight Zone, at its best, never let audiences off that hook. It was never about the monster under the bed. It was always about the monster that builds the bed, sleeps in it every night, and refuses to examine what's underneath. The Encounter was pulled from circulation because it made people uncomfortable, because it presented a Japanese American character whose father may have been disloyal, and because that presentation, in 1964, felt like an accusation against an entire community that had already suffered enough. That discomfort was real, and the criticism was not without merit. But the episode was also pulled because it made a white veteran uncomfortable, because it did not let Fenton be the hero of his own war story, because it suggested that what he did in the Pacific, the way he did it, the trophies he brought home, the silence he maintained about it, was also a form of haunting he deserved to reckon with. And that part of the discomfort, the part about accountability rather than accusation, was something the network was far less willing to acknowledge. Censorship is rarely about protecting people from dangerous ideas. It is usually about protecting institutions from uncomfortable questions.